NBC News correspondent David Noriega joins me from Los Angeles. Also with me is NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard. He's at Fort Bragg, along with NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Thank you all for joining me. David, I want to start with you on the ground there in L.A. Describe the scene there compared to what we were seeing yesterday at this time.
Yeah, Gabe, let me show you. So I'm directly behind the complex of federal buildings that has been the target of protests over the last several days. As you can see, there are still some National Guard troops posted here who've been here for the last, since Sunday. And around me, if I can have Alan just show the scene right now, there is a pretty small and up until now 100% peaceful group of protesters that has gathered here in just the last hour or two. Now, what I'm seeing now, on the basis also of what I observed yesterday, is that this group, as long as it remains peaceful, will likely be left alone. There's only one issue. They're kind of spilling out onto the street here. This is a very busy street, Alameda in downtown LA. There's a lot of traffic here. The police want to keep the street open. They have already given people orders to get off the street and onto the sidewalk a couple of times. If they keep having to do that and people keep spilling out onto the street, there's a chance that the LAPD will declare an unlawful assembly, and then things might get a little bit more confrontational. But I do want to point out, Gabe, that, yesterday and what I expect today we'll see was a massive, absolutely tremendous show of force by local, state, and county law enforcement, in many cases far outnumbering protesters. And we saw a pretty large percentage of protesters being willing to obey the orders of police. When LAPD would order them to disperse from an intersection, they would gladly do so. Immediately after these lawful orders to disperse, the crowds tended to thin quite a bit. Now, of course, there are always a relatively small percentage of these crowds that, as a sort of matter of ideological commitment and tactics, do not obey orders from the police. We're likely to encounter those again today, but the numbers don't seem to be very high, Gabe, particularly not compared to the absolutely, again, as far in my years of covering protests, have never seen the sheer display of force that we saw from local, state, and county law enforcement yesterday. Last thing worth pointing out, that actually the National Guard troops that you see, they've been staying put in the immediate, in the entrances and the immediate, on the property of this complex of federal buildings, barely interacting with protesters at all, Gabe.
David, we've been watching this unfold over the last several days, and it's usually over the next several hours, the afternoon into evening hours out there on the West Coast, that things start to heat up. Is there a sense of tension there today? And you describe things as being a little bit calmer, perhaps, and you're describing this, the overwhelming force that we've seen from the Trump administration. Do you attribute that overwhelming number of, local police, also Marines, National Guard, do you attribute that law enforcement presence to perhaps calming things down a bit, or no?
So the trend line between Sunday and Monday was definitely a calming down, and the protests were less. Sunday is when we saw people flood onto the 101 freeway, block it for a substantial period of time, set multiple driverless, Waymo taxis on fire. That kind of behavior was really on Sunday. Monday, we saw a little bit of that kind of thing, but much less. I do attribute that to the massive display of force, which, by the way, it's important to clarify, that display of force came from local law enforcement, not from National Guard troops, not from DHS police. And, what you have to consider there is that what's at stake for Mayor Bass, for Governor Newsom, for Police Chief McDonnell, is they are out to prove to the Trump administration and to the people of LA that they can handle this, that they've seen this kind of unrest before. LA is, mass demonstrations are not unfamiliar in this city, and local law enforcement. They've also pulled in reinforcements from multiple law enforcement agencies. Counties surrounding all of the cities in LA County are contributing personnel. A police captain here yesterday told me they had somewhere between 12 and 1,300 police units out on the streets of downtown LA, substantially more than the number of protesters I could see. So yes, I do attribute the calming down to the presence of law enforcement just based on what I observed. It is, though, tense, Gabe. I don't want to give you the impression that, everything is fine and there's no chance that there might be future conflagrations as we move into the evening hours, Gabe.
And David, over the last several days, I've been watching your reporting, and I take your point that, for those on the ground, those protesters, especially those that are extremely angry at what's going on over there with regards to the ICE arrest, that they don't pay attention to the back and forth, the daily back and forth coming out of Washington. But today, the president did say that if he had not sent in the National Guard and the Marines, that L.A. would be on fire. I want to know, have you spoken to anybody on the ground that perhaps may have listened to what the president said today? And I'm curious if there's any reaction there.
Great question, Gabe. I think you have to consider that the sorts of answers I'm going to get from people to that question here are by and large going to be pretty defiant, right? And that is the tone that I get from people when I ask them about the National Guard deployment, about the Marine deployment. They say, Trump is trying to scare us and we are not scared, right? That's kind of the sentiment that I've heard pretty repeatedly from people. It's a difficult counterfactual to address, right? I don't know what would have happened if the National Guard troops hadn't been deployed. It is possible that things could have gotten more rowdy, could have gotten bigger. It is possible that the presence of the National Guard kind of diffused or deterred some larger or more rowdy protests. From what I've observed on the ground, though, again, Gabe, really the deterrent effect that I've seen has been as a result of the massive and very coordinated crowd, sometimes very aggressive crowd control efforts by local, county, and state law enforcement, Gabe.
David Noriega, live for us in L.A. David, I want you to stick with us in case anything unfolds during this hour. But now I want to turn to Vaughn Hillyard. He's at Fort Bragg, where we understand Marine One has just landed near your location. We expect the president to speak in just a short time. Now, Vaughn, the president and the administration seem eager to lean into these localized protests. They're warning about potential deployments in other cities as well. So what do we expect to hear from the president? And do we expect more troops on the ground in L.A.?
Right, and actually, as we speak here, I'm going to have David, and just for you can catch this scene, because I think that this is part of the week that is, not only here at Fort Bragg, but that is Marine One with the president coming in for this event here at one of the U.S. Army's largest military installations. Of course, this is happening just days before the military parade in Washington, D.C. is set to take place on the 250th anniversary of the Army here. All of this is a moment in which usually Americans are used to seeing America's military might being a presence overseas, engaged in military intervention. But here, the site that has been lifted up by this president here in the early part of this week and weekend is using the military, unlike past presidents, for domestic purposes on America's streets here. We expect to hear from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in just a matter of minutes here from now before the president takes the stage, Gabe. And ultimately, this is for the president, on one hand, a celebration of the servicemen and women who have served the U.S. military, particularly the U.S. Army. At the same time, a very keen sense of wanting to show on the international stage the type of weaponry and the type of manpower that the U.S. has. Just before he took Marine One over here, just a couple miles from where we are at one of the Fort Bragg fields, there were 600 paratroopers that descended from the skies. There were Army members that came out of tanks. There were artillery that were fired in front of the president, who was in a bunker watching all of this unfold here. Effectively a simulation, a demonstration for him here firsthand. Gabe.
You know, Vaughn, we've seen the escalating feud between President Trump and California Governor Gavin Newsom. What is the latest in terms of when the president last communicated with the governor? I know there was some back and forth today on that.
Yeah, I want to let you hear directly from the president earlier, where he suggested that he had placed a phone call to the California governor. Take a listen. And I'm not sure if we have that bite, but earlier today in the Oval Office, apologies, Gabe, the president suggested that he had placed a phone call to Gavin Newsom, whose office, in very direct terms, said that no such call took place and that there was no engagement, no voicemail that was left from the White House. In response, the communications director, Stephen Chung, said that, in fact, the only person lying was Gavin Newsom. Now, we should be clear that there is a long history of this president making inaccurate statements here. But when it comes to the engagement between these two men, they tried on a tarmac earlier this year. They sat down and had conversations about the wildfire response in the aftermath of the devastating fires that took out thousands of homes. But this is different here. And the president making clear that he was not going to wait for any sort of approval from Gavin Newsom and will continue in just the last 24 hours with the decision to send more than 700 Marines, will continue to do what he deems necessary in response to the protests that have taken place, in response to the use of ICE agents to carry out federal immigration raids in Los Angeles.
Vaughn Hillyard live for us in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. As we continue to look at those live pictures, we're waiting the president to come to the stage there and deliver some remarks. Vaughn, I want you to stay with us. But now I want to turn to Courtney Kube. Courtney, what role will the Marines have in assisting in Los Angeles? Are they even trained for domestic protests?
Well, some of those Marines are actually undergoing some training right now. But, Gabe, this isn't the kind of training you might think that Marines would be going through in some sort of when you're talking about infantry or something like that. This is more like teaching them what the rules of force would be if they are going out on the streets of L.A. as part of this Task Force 51, sort of what their left and right limits are going to be for what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. But two sources familiar tell us that, in fact, these Marines are, most of them, if not all of them, will actually be assigned to guarding and protecting ICE personnel as part of this deployment. And as part of that, they may even be transporting them around. This is causing some concern because it really moves right up to what we have been talking about for the last several days here, is how active duty troops, including these active duty Marines from 29 Palms, are not allowed to engage in classic law enforcement missions while here in the United States. That's been one of the biggest controversies ever since the president decided to start sending first National Guard and then these Marines to California to quell these protesters. The 4,100 now National Guard troops are also on federal active duty, known as Title 10. They're also restricted from these kinds of activities, law enforcement activities. The concern here is this is really walking right up to that line here, and it could put these Marines in a difficult position, Gabe.
And Courtney, I see you're on Capitol Hill, not your usual post at the Pentagon, but we were discussing Secretary Hegseth's first congressional testimony since being confirmed on the job a little earlier today. What were your top takeaways from that?
Yeah, there were a couple of fireworks specifically about the cost and the overall mission for the Marines and for the National Guard who are now in L.A. There was definite frustration by some of the members of the House Appropriations Committee Defense Subcommittee today, the panel, about the fact that the Defense Department just hasn't put forward a budget. And so here they're at a hearing, a posture hearing or a budget hearing, and they can't really ask a lot of specifics because the Department of Defense hasn't provided them with those sorts of details. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro really laying into Secretary Hegseth about that, raising her voice and pointing at him about how she needs specifics. They need some numbers here. But, Gabe, one of the things that I was really struck by here is, as you mentioned, this was the first time we have heard from Pete Hegseth since he became the Secretary of Defense, since his confirmation back in January. And there have been so many issues that have happened in these last several months. Secretary Hegseth doesn't brief the press. He's never briefed us in the briefing room. We have very little opportunity to ever ask him questions. So I know we were looking forward to hearing about things like Signalgate, you know, and some of the many other issues that he has dealt with, including the operations against the Houthis, the ultimate cost of that, the consolidation of the combatant commands. I mean, some of these issues that we have been watching for months now and not gotten answers to, but the reality is we didn't get any of those answers here today. Secretary Hegseth will be on the Hill again tomorrow and Thursday, so we may have another opportunity. And speaking of Secretary Hegseth right now, we were watching those live pictures. He just came on stage there at Fort Bragg again as we await the president's remarks. Courtney, really quickly before I let you go, there was also a Pentagon official that estimated how much these deployments to L.A. might cost. What can you tell me about that? Yeah, the acting comptroller saying that as of now, the estimate is $134 million for this deployment. Now, this basically just includes the food, the travel, the basic per diem for these now 4,800 or so National Guard and Marines who are there assigned. Courtney Kube live for us at the Pentagon.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.